solid matches or pretty close, like reasonable assurance that this is the person you're talking about. And it was kind of telling. I had to admit I had a moment there when I was like, oh. But it was fascinating as well. So, and especially today when we have so much technology and ability to collate data and quickly, what used to be anonymous or really out of reach for re-identification isn't, even with genetics and stuff like that. It's just becoming more and more accessible. What we didn't dream was possible 15 years ago is very possible today, and those advances are just coming quicker and quicker and quicker. Activities not requiring review. I think this is an important one to go through, and then I'm going to launch right into the harmonized. Go ahead.
Sorry, can I just go back to
Sure. Yeah.
Slide? I just was looking at the changes in the 2014
Yep.
BCEHI
Yep.
And noticed that classrooms, emergency rooms, and religious institutions were removed in lots of examples. Does that mean that they're no longer considered
Public places.
where people have no reason to
Yeah. No.
expectation of privacy?
Yeah. So I should have. I skipped it for the purpose of time, but I should have highlighted that. I think that's an important shift. That is what that means, essentially. The original version of the second TCPS 2 said that classrooms, emergency rooms, and religious institutions were an example of public places where you could walk in and observe, where people, didn't have an expectation of privacy. I remember doing a talk for a class, and there was about 120 kids, and they all had, they weren't kids, they were first-year students, but they had clickers and it was great because I was able to ask them a question, and then they could say yes or no, and immediately you see this graph of what's the percentage of people said yes and what's the percentage of people said no. And I asked them whether they would feel comfortable if they found out that there was a researcher sitting at the back of the classroom recording what they were saying and looking at their demographics just by appearances and trying to collate, let's say, with confidence amongst first-year students. And I expected it to be like everybody would say they have an expectation of privacy, but that's not actually true. There was about 60% were okay with that. Now that's just anecdotal evidence, but for me, I personally would probably wonder about that, especially certain classrooms can be quite intimate, especially at the graduate level. You can have 3 or 4 people in there. And so I think the expectation of privacy does shift around a bit, but I think when you're talking about classrooms or religious institutions, as another example, like just think of you getting married in a church. Does that mean that technically it does mean anybody can come in and watch your wedding, but if people were recording it for research purposes, that might make you feel uncomfortable. I think you do have an expectation of privacy. Some people would, anyways. And so I think, in some extent, it was good for them to change them. Although certainly, if you're doing health research and you're used to being able to observe in emergency rooms, that can be, it might be a problem for you. But again, it's not that they have used these now as examples where there is an expectation of privacy. They've just removed them of an example where there's no expectation of privacy. So you can still make an argument for why you wouldn't or would require review. I would just say that if you want to do observational research in emergency rooms, you might want to check with your rep and discuss with somebody your rationale for whether or not it would require review or not. It could be just the size of the emergency room. If it was a huge intake emergency room where there was, 200 people sitting in the waiting room, and you were just, observing what people do while they wait, there might be a fairly high argument to make that there's no expectation of privacy amongst people. So this person's on the phone, that kid is reading this, and you're just looking at that. There might be an argument there. However, if you're looking at particular illnesses related to, and hospital staff and how they interact when people come in when what is a perceived emergency, let's say when blood is present versus what is maybe not as urgent, or, and you're looking at hospital staff interactions, I can see there being a higher expectation of privacy. Again, these are just examples I'm giving on the fly, but certainly you would want to call and check with your ethics office at that point. So the next slide, I'm going to jump right into harmonization. So when I first started in the field of research ethics almost 9 years ago, actually it was about 9 years ago, what I did was, compared to what I do now, seems in retrospect very insular. I was concerned with UBC policies and UBC researchers. And honestly, my day-to-day was talking to UBC researchers about their specific approval here at UBC. Now, and this is not an exaggeration, daily, I am on the phone with an administrator somewhere, whether or not they are at Interior or Island Health or across the country. We've joint reviewed studies from different provinces, or even just to talk about a problem that came up in research ethics. So the nature of research has changed, and because of that, I think research ethics is changing as well. I think research has changed. It just seems to be larger in scope. I think electronic data and technological advances have made it easier in some instances and actually harder in other incidents when privacy becomes a concern. But to share and collate, scope can be easier. It's easier to have bigger scope, more numbers. It makes your research more rigorous at times. And there's a demand for multi-jurisdictional research as well. So certainly one of the responses here is that research ethics is also trying to stay on top of this and make health research more attractive in BC. And one of the things, obviously, is a bunch of logistical, and which you all have been through and you will go through, is what do you need to do to get approval to conduct research at UBC in the health authorities. So the BC Harmonization Initiative aims to create efficient, coordinated, and high-quality processes that support and encourage multi-jurisdictional human health research. So the goal is essentially to make, as I just said, research more attractive in the province, to attract research, to attract researchers to the province, to have a rich and vital research environment here. So the idea behind this is that we would harmonize your reviews. So in the case that you have 2 sites that you need research ethics, you would have to normally go through UBC and Island Health. Now you would only need to go through 1. So just to go a little bit over who is BCEHI. So BCEHI is the BC Ethics Harmonization Initiative. It was funded by the Michael Smith Foundation, and it includes stakeholders from across the province in both the academic and health sectors. So partners include Fraser Health, Interior, Island Health, Northern Health, and then the academic institutions, Simon Fraser, University of British Columbia, University of Northern British Columbia, and the University of Victoria. So this is pretty much all of the major institutions in the province. To be clear on what multi-jurisdictional research is in the context of this grant, it originally started out to be 3 or more sites. So not just simple dyads where you're doing two sites. It really was in the context of 2 or more. 3 or more. However, in practice, people are using this model and the initiative for 2 or more. I think there's, sorry. Is that confusing?
No, I just was going to ask if Vancouver Coastal Health is not part of it.
It is part of it. That's actually a good point. It's often not mentioned because it's under the umbrella of UBC. But I think you're right that it should be mentioned, sort of Vancouver Coastal. So yes, it is. Of course, it is. It's just that the BREB acts as the board of for research ethics, and the clinical board for UBC acts as the research ethics board for Vancouver Coastal. So they kind of fall under the umbrella of University of British Columbia. In the cases again that you're doing research in more than 1 site, you would want to call us and figure out how we can approach this. The next slide is really about how to approach your harmonized review. And then I'll go over the 2 models. So if you are doing research that involves 2 sites, and you know it involves 2 sites, and again, this can mean that you are a UBC student and you're doing research in a health authority or 2 health authorities. So this could be you next term. The best way to start off your harmonized review is to give us a call. However, there is also a cover sheet that is available This cover sheet just gives us basic information about your project. What are the sites? What is the risk level in your project? What is the sort of the premise? Is it clinical? Is it behavioral? Just gives us some information in order for us to then connect with the people who are involved. It's also a conversation starter, so I get the cover sheet and then I can forward that really quite easily to the 3 different health authorities that are involved. Then what we have is sort of deciding on the board of record. Now the board of record is a difficult, well, it's not difficult. We have clear criteria of what the board of, or who the board of record should be. But it's often a discussion that takes place amongst involved partners, so we wouldn't ask the researcher per se to decide on that. But you might have an idea there, and I will go over what the board of record criteria is in a second. But essentially, it's the institution that is hosting the research most directly. And this includes both participants or patient data and or affiliation. And I'll go over it bullet by bullet in just a second. Once the board of record is decided, the researcher fills out an application for that site, and then the board of record administrators take over coordinating the research ethics component for that site for all the other sites. So it's great for the researchers because you have one port of entry for all your research ethics. It does mean, as far as timelines go, that it doesn't necessarily mean that it will go through quicker than it would normally have if you had to go through 5 sites. Essentially, it just means that whoever would have taken the longest, if you went through 5 separate sites, it will take that long, because essentially what happens is you put it through the one port of entry, everybody will review it, and then you get one set of provisos back, and I'll explain how that differs between minimal risk and above minimal risk. But then you respond to those provisos, and then you would get approval, and you'd get approval for all sites at the same time. We're in the pilot stage right now. The above minimal risk model will be launched soon, but the minimal risk model was launched in December, and it's already getting quicker. At first, there was a bit of hiccups because we were trying to figure out how this would fit in with everybody's administrative process. But now we're getting more efficient, and things are starting to sort of be a little bit more streamlined. But your expected review times should be similar to what you would expect for a single review, if that makes sense. So where you're saving the time is if you have 5 sites, you're only filling out 1 application versus 5, and you're only doing 1 proviso response versus 5. So I'll walk you through the actual model really quickly, and then I'll do the above minimal risk model, and then we can just open it up for questions at that point. So the above minimal risk model, the minimal risk model is the most commonly used. Most research that's been going through as of now has been minimal risk. So first of all, the PI initiates the ethics application. You see that is done in a variety of ways, but essentially it's that cover sheet that I pointed to, and there's a link there that you can follow. But it also can happen in a number of ways. Sometimes it happens that someone just submits an application to us, and we notice that it includes multi-jurisdictions. Other times they've made contact with us beforehand. Other time, it can happen in a variety of different ways. The cleanest way is the cover sheet, because what can happen in the worst case scenario is you submit to Island Health. They coordinate with everybody. We all look at Island Health's application and we say, it's great, but UBC should be the board of record here because we hold the most, based on the board of record. So then you would have to fill out the RISE application. So it's always best to touch base before you start filling out anybody's application. The board of record criteria, which I was going to read off of my slides, I can't see it at all. Just to go over this really quickly, if the study involves a health authority, the board of record will be the representing that health authority. If there is more than one health authority involved, the board of record will be the primary location where the research will take place, or if all things are equal, the health authority where the PI holds their primary appointment. If no health authority is involved, the board of record will be the representing the institution where the PI holds their primary appointment. In the event that the majority of the research will take place in an institution other than that of the PI's primary appointment, the Board of Record may be the rep that represents the institution where the research will take place. And that just, it kind of shows that there is a little bit of discussion there. If it just absolutely doesn't make sense and all the research is taking place at a different institution and the PI's appointment somewhere else, then it might make sense to have it over there. But generally, this is designed to be, it's really around the nuances of health data access within the health authorities. So where, if you're pulling patient data, that there's often a level of nuances is the best way of how you approach that another health authority isn't going to know. And so if so when they're reviewing your applications, they may not ask the right questions, they may not have the right requirements, that sort of thing. So it's always, we kind of focus it on where the participant's going to be and where is the health data coming from. And then from there, of course, all things being equal, it would be the PI's affiliation and or where the participants are coming from. And the last one is just a Northern Health caveat. If Northern Health, it doesn't have a TCPS certified board, if it would be the Board of Record based on this criteria, then UNBC would be the Board of Record. So essentially then for the minimal risk model, what happens is you submit the application to the Board of Record. The Board of Record actually reviews it, and they send their review in whatever format that might take to the other boards. The other boards then do a proportionate review. And what's happening, and which is exciting, is we're seeing a lot of trust happening and forming, which is that another board might look at the study really quickly and say, you know, we accept UBC's review of that, and there's actually no review at all. But what they are really looking at is a site proportionate review. So this is a review that is just going to be around maybe internal logistics around, oh, we have this requirement for this line in the consent form, but it's not a full review of the ethics in the application. But they all have a chance to add provisos to what, and provisos are just changes within the study, to what the Board of Record has outlined. And then the administrator would take all of those provisos and send them back to the researcher. The researcher would then send their response back to the Board of Record, just as they normally would in any ethics application. And if it's minimal risk, generally what happens is the Board of Record would resolve those provisos with the PI without going back to the other sites. If there was a specific request by one of the sites to see a proviso response, at that point they would see it. But this all happens behind the scenes, but just so you know what's going on. They would circulate that to the particular board. But the idea is, again, to execute maximal reciprocity and trust. It's not direct reciprocity, but we're working towards it. So moving to the full board model, so this is above minimal risk. You initiate your application in exactly the same way. You would do it through this cover sheet, or you'd pick up the phone. That would come to the boards. Your risk level would be looked at. A Board of Record would be decided, and then you would submit an application. That application would go to the next Board of Records meeting. So this is a full board meeting, and then representatives from the other research ethics boards involved would attend that meeting. And they can attend it in a variety of ways. It's probably most likely going to be through teleconference. But they would attend that meeting and they would make sure that their site-specific concerns are there, and also their ethical concerns. This is a full board study, so based on proportionality, the higher the risk of the study, the higher the scrutiny. So they could consult with their own home board if they wanted to before they went to the full board review. They could also send more than one reviewer if they wanted to. But in practice, I'm assuming we're going to see probably the chairs of most of the boards participating in these above minimal risk reviews. And then again, you would see the provisos be resolved exactly in the same way as you normally would for a full board review. They would be resolved how it was decided in the meeting. That could be with the researcher, with the chair of the Board of Record without going back to the health authorities, or the other boards involved, or they could be resolved with them if that was what was decided. And again, that's just sort of how the boards are run anyways. At times reviewers look at some of the proviso responses, at times they don't. So it would be decided within the actual research project or sorry, the board meeting whether or not to resolve the provisos by the chair or by the chair and a couple representatives from either the board or other reps. So at this point, I have no idea really what time it is, but if 1:45, so I'm basically just finishing up now. If UBC is determined to be the board of record, and it may be in the case of your research, you would submit your application online. Again, touch base with us before you do this, and the cover sheet will help us figure this out. But once it's been determined that UBC is the board of record, you submit your application and associated documents online. You'd have to go through the same process as you normally would for any ethics application. In fact, you may not even really notice the difference between a harmonized review and a regular review. There might be a slight lag in time, turnaround times, depending, but slightly would be, a week, not weeks. Yeah, so I just put that slide up there just in case nobody has submitted to RISE. That's how you access RISE. I'm not going to go into that. And then if you have any questions about this process, I put Wendy Bond up there. She's the project coordinator for the BCEHI. So she definitely can help you, find the cover sheet, problem shoot around which, what your project is, how it would fit into to the harmonization initiative. Certainly if you know that your project is harmonized and it's behavioral, you can also call me. And in the long term, definitely I would be a contact for any harmonized or regular study that you have coming through UBC, particularly in the behavioral research ethics board, or the behavioral side of things. Anyway, so I'll leave it at that. If you have any questions, please let me know. No?
Well, people are thinking, just because I know a bit about this, I think it's important to point out, I think it's a fantastic project, so I'm slightly biased, but just to show what the benefits are, yes, it might take a little bit longer, but what I see as two huge benefits is you don't have to duplicate paperwork. Like if you were doing it in 2 universities and 2 health authorities, you potentially might have to fill out 4 sets of applications instead of 1 for each, which is work. The other thing is you might get 4 different responses from 4 different REDs. This one thinks it's not research at all, and this one thinks it is, but it's minimal risk, and this one thinks it's above minimal risk. Whereas now you're submitting to one, and that discussion is happening in different REDs. So you're not all of a sudden getting these 4 different sets of providers and responses from different REDs and trying to juggle what that means. So to me, working in research, I think that's a huge
It's a huge step forward, I think, for us, too, in the research ethics world, because ethics is not black and white. There are inconsistencies, but they're not helpful for researchers. And the other thing that's not helpful is when one board wants this in the consent form, another board wants this in the consent form, as Patricia pointed out. And I really can't emphasize those benefits enough, because that is what people are tired of. And then you're grappling with 5 different response rates, 5 different research ethics. It's a lot of paperwork, it's a lot of back and forth, and it's a lot of different systems. RISE can be an excellent system if you know how to use it, but you know what? Every other institution has their version of RISE, which is not always electronic. Sometimes it's paper, sometimes it's email, sometimes it's, and it can become unwieldy really quickly. And then I get the phone call with a really frustrated researcher who wants to know whether they now need to submit an amendment because Island Health wanted this, and and it becomes almost like a constant runaround, because you submit something for review that Island Health wanted, and then our reviewers say, depending on the opinion, there are divergent opinions, and so they need to be talked out, and having that done behind scenes in an efficient way is advantageous for everybody. Oh, you know what? I should have really emphasized. I meant when I put the slide up to really kind of have some sort of music play in the background and have confetti fall from the ceiling. The above minimal risk model is going to be launched. When I said soon, it is as close as May 1st. However, if you have an above minimal risk study you want to put through, we will catch it and we will likely just put it through the model. In practice, people are already starting this. We are evaluating all of this data, so we want to make sure that we capture as much as we can about what's happening with research in BC, and we have that data to show Michael Smith and UBC what's happening, and hopefully to get more money, to be honest, to keep it running, right? So if you do have an above minimal risk study, please contact us in the same way you would for the minimal risk, and we will make sure that it's harmonized. A note, and I don't know if any of you are working on sort of industry-sponsored clinical trials, they are considered out of scope. Although I think that even if they were in scope, it would be difficult for us to find one that would fit the criteria. But yeah, so the launch is coming, and it really is with a lot of stuff that's just going down right now. We thought probably it may not be May 1st, but it's probably middle of May. We're just gathering feedback and making sure everybody's on side right now. But I know of at least 2 studies that have gone through in a sort of pilot testing out the model spirit. The spirit in BC right now is let's try to make it work. Let's try to make it as easy and to facilitate as much as we can. So if we can harmonize in some way, we will do it.
Thank you, Jean.
You're welcome.
Canada is actually an interesting site that has launched, an event that happened in Canada a few years ago has launched the international ethics that now governs ethics around authorship. And that was the case that some of you who are in Canada might recognize, of an engineering department in Quebec in which the department head insisted on being named in all of the papers that were published by all faculty without any involvement. Clear power dynamic. There were lots of other things going on in that department at the time, but a faculty member by the name of Valerie Fabricant came into the department and shot and killed 4 of them. So that case was, Canadians, for those of you who aren't Canadian, Canadians don't do guns and shooting in academic departments. It was a shocking, shocking event, and it changed Canadian university law, but it also led to some really clear articulation about what constitutes authorship that has now become international standard. So there's actually reasonable reasons to be sure that you are part of attending to authorship. And I realize there's gray areas. The example you're giving is one in which there's a judgment to be had. But I think the safest is to always have that conversation at the beginning as to what the expectations are. There are some times in which the contribution of an idea is so pivotal to the work that you may decide that even if that individual virtually disappeared after a certain point, that the authorship would be legitimized. And in some journals, they'll actually ask you to articulate what's the nature of that contribution. So you might say, this idea came from this, and this was developed by this. But in many situations, that the contribution of an idea at an early point shouldn't justify authorship at the end, particularly if that individual has disappeared. As a journal editor, I fairly often receive manuscripts which clearly are written without English as a first language and have significant problems in English. And then when you look at the authorship list, there are native-born senior academic English speakers on the list. You know that they didn't read the manuscript, they weren't involved in it, and what's their role? Do you see what I'm getting at? So that as an author, you have a responsibility. And I'm not suggesting that anyone should do it all, but really if there are basic grammar errors, for example, and there was a full professor in a UK university on the list, there's something faulty about that process. And increasingly, editors will notice that and send it back. So it is a hard call, and I think the safest is always to lay those expectations down. So that if somebody disappears, if somebody doesn't respond, and those who've been on teams will know that. You send it out to the team and somebody never answers. I'm going to look at that someday. Eventually the team has to do it. And that's why I think having clarity at the beginning as to who will be the decider. None of us in nursing, we don't like to be you know, we like to be democratic. We like to assume we're collaborative and everybody's going to contribute. But it really does help to say, I'll be the decider for this paper. The next paper we work on, you be the decider. We'll share that role perhaps. But if I'm the principal investigator and I'm financially responsible to whoever the funder is, I'm probably the one that needs to make sure. And if there are people who came to be involved that we didn't expect to be involved, they'll get named, and if there are people who dropped off. The other example is often when often a group will begin by creating an abstract for a conference, you know, because that's a fairly manageable thing. You say, we've got this great clinical project, we're going to sit down and here's the 5 people who are working on it. We submit it, a couple months later you hear it was accepted, 6 months later the conference happens, and 2 of them have dropped off the map by then. The other 3 have put all the work into the presentation and presented it. Do you list them all or not? Probably at the conference, because they're in the program, it would be bad form to list only the 3 coming. You know what I mean? So probably at the conference that's okay, but then when you go write it up for publication, they shouldn't be on the list. And if you haven't had the conversation in advance, it becomes really difficult to cut people out at that point. You can appreciate the problem. So as nurses, we preempt and prevent problems, and the best way to prevent it is to have those conversations at the beginning, create clarity as to how it'll be decided.